So for this part, and again, with the square roots, everything that we've been doing, it's all kind of leading up to this thing. That for this part today, we're looking at complex numbers. All right, and a couple of days ago, we had a shortcut on one of these. If we had like x squared equals 16, as long as it was just x squared in the number, we could square root both sides. And then we would take the square root of 16, figure out that's going to be 4. And because of the square roots that was here, we said for this one, because it was x squared, we know we're looking for two answers, we had to put a plus or minus for this thing. Okay, now, so that was the part without anything. For this part, here's where we're kind of going to. What if our next question is x squared equals negative 25? All right, if it was x squared equals 25, we would square root both sides. And go from there. But if it's negative, this is where your calculator is not going to like you very much. Because if we go in over here and we square root negative 25, it's going to tell you it's a domain error, which means for this part of it means this is not, there's no answer in this case. But we're going to add like one little detail for this one. We're going to say that there's no real answer for this thing. Because the domain error basically means it's not a real number is what it's coming down to and saying. Is that there's not a real answer. It's going to be an imaginary answer. Okay, and when we were doing the quadratic formula, that if we had square root of, if we were going back to that last problem we had on the board a minute ago, that if we were doing the b squared minus 4ac, if this came out to be negative, we said there were no real answers. And this basically is still that same thing, that there's not real answers, it's imaginary answers. So here's basically what that's going to be when it talks about what something imaginary is. So imaginary numbers use the I variable. A lot of people go, that looks like a sideways J. Well, when they use I in this case, they always make it italicized, so you hardly ever will see I written like, the old standard lowercase I. You hardly ever see it written like that. They almost always write it with an italicized form where it's got that curve to it there. Math Excel, if you use this one, it's okay. But I think a lot of times on that one, they'll actually have a button that's I like that because it's its own special little thing that's there. So when we're doing this problem up here, we had square root of negative 25 was going to equal no solution, no answer, not possible, whatever how you want to say it. So now we're going to replace the negative that's in this square root, this negative that's part of the negative 25 here. We're going to replace that negative with I squared. And here's the one big thing we're going to kind of come back to today and tomorrow, because we're going to work this for a couple of days. The big thing we're looking at for this part of it, if you need your moment of the day here, that anytime we do anything with the I variable, the I squared is always going to equal negative 1. Okay, so now we're going to solve this thing so you can actually see, because again, before, when we square rooted it, we would say that this was no real solution or no answer, whatever you want to say it. This one, we're going to actually show you how to do that with this part right here. Okay, so and you're maybe going, where's the negative 1 in this case? Well, for this particular problem, if you take the negative 25 and think that that's actually negative 1 times 25, take the negative and put a 1 with it. Well, now you've got negative 25. If we rewrite it as negative 1 times 25, then you can take out the negative 1 and put an I squared in the spot. Okay, and with most math problems, we usually put the variable second and not first. So if we do that, we'll make it 25I squared. Okay, and then we'll look at it in two pieces. If we take the square root of 25, we know that would be 5. And just like when we did the square root of 16, we used the plus or minus. This one, if we square root 25, we would still use the plus or minus. And then if we square root the I squared part, if you square root I squared, then basically these two things kind of cancel each other out and just give you the I variable. So it's just going to be plus or minus 5I. Okay, so here's the big difference on these. Here's the only difference in these. If it's square root of a positive number, it's just the number, plus or minus. If it's square root of a negative number, it's still the square root of that number, but at the end of it, you just put an I variable to let us know that in the beginning, it was a negative number, so it's not a real number. It's what they call an imaginary number. And that's just that thing of saying basically that if this has an I attached to it, that meant we took the square root of a negative number and not a positive number, and that's all that it is. So again, if this was x squared equals 25, and we were taking the square root of it, it would just be plus or minus 5. But when you put the negative in there, you need to put the I variable there. And that's it. That's all that's doing is just kind of marking that one to say that, okay, when we square root this problem, it's a negative number, so we're going to put an I here to let us know it's not a real number, it's an imaginary number. Okay, now, and one other thing, if the homework or if the test questions say anything about if anywhere, if you're doing this problem, if you see where it says it talks anything about the principal square root, sometimes it says principal square root, or it may just say the principal root for this thing. For that part of it, you just assume the answer is positive. That if you see that part of it, you don't need the plus or minus in the answer. So back up here, if they were saying take the principal square root of this number, you could just write 5I and not the plus or minus 5I. Okay, and just to show you kind of the difference of the answers and the questions in this one, we'll give you two examples where it says just find the principal square root of some numbers, and another one where it just says to solve, or just find all roots, and that way you can kind of see the difference of the two. Okay, so if it said find the principal square root of 49, square root of 49 would just be 7. So that one you can just say 7, and it's not a big deal. Now, if we go back even like a couple of days ago, if it said find the principal square root of, and if this thing wasn't a perfect square, let's say it was the square root of 20. This is where, again, you'd have to kind of take this number and break it down. I'm going to do it on the side over here just because I'm running out of room.
We're just going to trade it off for the next 3 weeks.
Okay, so breaking down to 20. Again, if we go with the stack method here, it would be 2 times 10. 10 is still even, so we can divide it by 2 to make it 2 times 5. So if we take 20 and break it down like we were doing the other day, it's 2 times 2 times 5. Got a pair of 2's, so that 2 will get out. So final answer for this one will be a 2 square root of 5. Okay, so if it asks you to find the principal square root or the principal root, you do not have to worry about the plus or minus. You just give me the number. Don't worry about any signs for anything. Just leave it just like it is. And again, that just means it's still the same answer. You just don't have to worry about the plus or minus for that one. If in the work it says list all the square roots, they'll probably do something like this where they'll say just list all the roots. And then they'll give you something like this where you're doing the square root of 100. Well, if it's 100, then you'll do a plus or minus 10. If it's negative, still would be basically the same thing if it was negative 64. We would still do the square root of 64, which would be 8. We'll do the plus or minus. But again, the only thing you need in the answer is because it's negative here, you just need to put an I in the answer there. And if you don't see the cursive italicized I in the parts of Math Excel, you can just use the regular just I that's on your keyboard, just lowercase I, and that would be fine. Okay, so taking the square roots of negative numbers, again, just working with those numbers. Sometimes it's perfect square roots. Sometimes it's not. So again, if we look at one more of these, let's say you're going to ask you to solve, and it's x squared equals, negative 80. If that's 81, that's great because that's 9 times 9. But if it's 80, that's where, again, we're going to have to take this thing and break it down. And even if it's a negative number, we're going to square root here for this part. And if you start to break this one down, and some people are like, what do we do? Because it's not a perfect square root. If it's the negative number, don't even worry about the negative. When you break this thing down, just work with 80. Don't worry about the negative. We'll bring that back at the end. 80 is even, so you can divide it by 2. That'll get you 40. 40 is still even, divide it by 2. You get 20. 20 is still even, divide it by 2. 20 divided by 2 is 10. 10 is still even, divided by 2 again. Finally leaves you with a 5. So if you're breaking down 80, it's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 5. And we know we got the negative. We'll get that here in just a second. There's a pair of 2's, so that 2 will get out. There's another pair of 2's. That 2 will get out. That 5 doesn't have a pair, doesn't have a buddy, so he stays stuck on the inside. So that makes it 2 times 2 times 5, which is just 4 square root of 5. Again, x squared, so we go plus or minus. And again, the only difference in the answer is if this was positive 80, it's 4 square root of 5. But because it's negative 80, you just put an I in the back end of the answer back here. Now, and sometimes with this one, again, if they said principal square root, we would leave the answer like this. If it doesn't say principal square root, which it didn't in this case, that's where you put your plus or minus. In the answer, you can write it like this. Sometimes with Math Excel, they will also let you do the answer like this because sometimes it's hard to tell if that I should be underneath the square root or not. Sometimes they'll put that I here just so you know that I is not underneath the square root. So they'll let either one of those two answers be what you're looking for. Okay, and then one other thing we've got with this part for the imaginary numbers, and then we'll wrap this up for the day. The one other thing we've got here that we'll talk about is powers of I. That there's a trick to some of these that you'll do as you go through this part. And again, this is where again calculators kind of come in handy. Hopefully on these, if not, you can just do regular division and see what's here. But basically, is this that if they're going to ask you to simplify I to some power, could be I to the 37th, could be I to the 19th, could be I to the 43rd. Doesn't matter what it is, just it's I to some power. Here's all you're going to do. You're going to divide the power by 4. So if it's I to the 37th, you would just take 37 and you would divide it by 4. Not that you can see that, but there we go. So we get 9.25. The remainder, which we'll call R in this case, is used to find the answer. So the remainder is not the answer, but it helps you define what the answer is going to be. Okay, so basically it's this. If your remainder equals 0, your answer equals 1. All right. If your remainder equals 1, your answer is going to equal I. Okay. If you do your division, you get a remainder of 2. Your answer is going to equal, negative 1. Oops, my bad. And if your remainder equals 3, your answer equals negative I. Okay, now a lot of these, you're going to be using calculators and not doing long division with hand, doing this division by hand in this case. So for calculators, so like this problem, we divided it, we got 0.25, for a problem like this. So on your calculator, this one has no remainder. So you can kind of skip this part. So if you're doing your calculator, if there's no decimal number at all, the answer to this simplified problem would just be 1. Okay. In this case, if you do it with 1, your remainder is going to be 0.25, kind of like this problem. So if we took 37 divided by 4, we got a remainder of 0.25. That means in this case, our answer would just be I. So if you use your calculator, you divide the two numbers you get. If your remainder equals 0.5, 0.5 or 0.50, whatever it comes up to, then your answer is going to be -1. And then the last thing is, if your remainder is 0.75, then your answer is going to be -I. Okay, so this is what the book will always talk about. If you're looking through the problem to help you in the homework, that's that. They're assuming that you're going to take this thing and divide it by hand. But honestly, y'all are probably going to be using calculators because it's going to be just a little bit quicker that way. So this is what you're looking for here. No remainder, remainder of 0.25, remainder of 0.5, or remainder of 0.75. And based on what this is the answer that you'll use over here. All right, here we go. And we'll just do 3 or 4 of these just so you can see what's happening. So we're going to simplify. All right, so your very first problem, let's do I to the 63rd power. Okay, so all we're going to do, take our power of 63 and divide it by 4. And all we're looking at is the remainder. The remainder is 0.75, our decimal number. So in that case, since our remainder is 0.75, okay, right here. So it's 15.75. The main thing is your remainder that's here. The remainder is 0.75, which is what we're talking about here. That means the answer is going to be -I.
Like that's what we put in as an answer?
Yep. And the way it's set up with Math Excel, it should just basically give you a box. I think in this case, they should just give you like, it's A, B, C, D. You just pick one of these 4 answers, and that's what you're looking for. So it'll be one of these answers every single time. So for example 2 here. All right, let's make it so it's just a little bit bigger. Let's say it's I to the 64 power. Okay, we'll take 64 divided by 4. In that case, it comes out to be 16 on the dot, no remainder. Okay, so there's no remainder here for this part of it. So if there's no remainder, your answer is 1. All right, so give me a big number up into the like high hundreds here. 473. There we go. All right, so example 3. We'll do I to the 473 power. Okay, so we're just going to take 473 divided by 4. That's going to be 118.25. And again, don't really care about the whole number part. It's the 0.25. So it's 118. But again, the big thing is that it's 0.25. And since that is 0.25, the answer is going to be I. Okay, and so for those, that's all it is. It gives you a number, take the exponent, divide it by 4, and it's going to be one of these 4 answers. It's either 1, I, -1, or -I, and all that just depends on the answers. Again, if you do it by hand, this is the remainder you're looking for, but let's be honest, everybody's going to be using a calculator. So based on what that remainder is here, that's what your answer is going to be there.